All right, let's get her started. A preamble. Have not really engaged much with, I believe his name is dexdigi's content. Obviously, you know, as we all know, I'm a dirty pre-watcher on this channel. Personally, I think it's fine to pre-watch, okay? I don't know, cope and seethe about it. But I've not really engaged much with dexdigi's content at all. My mistake, I suppose. He is an ex Vice interviewer, I believe. Like, you know, he's done the rounds talking about, like, you know, whatever. We all know, like, the Vice documentaries. They're typically quite well put together. And he did interviews with id Software's developers on the new Wolfensteins. Who remember these games? Who remembers these games? I remember, like, the most recent edition, what you were playing as, like, BJ Blazkowicz's daughters, I think. Murdering Nazis, as one does. The lore on, like, Wolfenstein is crazy. Basically, like, the Nazis were able to get, like, ridiculous technology from these, like, vaults that were discovered in, like, Germany, I think somewhere in Syria, and I think in Constantinople. So they were able to get this crazy technology and use it to easily crush everyone in World War II, so they were able to conquer the world. That's the lore behind, like, this reboot of Wolfenstein. You know, we got... Because there's, like, laser rifles and, like, mechs and shit in this game. Like, there's a lot of wacky stuff that's going on here. And, like, the Nazis, they were the ones who got their hands first, and, you know, yada, yada, yada. I've not really engaged much at all with, like, the new Wolfenstein games. I haven't played them. Yeah, there's a lot, obviously, a murdering of Nazis. Lots of that. Lots of killing of Nazis. Very, very, featured very prominently. But there was a sort of backlash to the messages that id Software was putting out, which dexdigi gets into, which was interesting. Interesting topic to sort of think about it. And that's primarily what we're going to be sort of like talking about here. That and like a lot of moral quandaries that the new Wolfenstein games, in particular this is Wolfenstein 2, A New Colossus, is making a player engage with. So that's what we want to mostly get into. Anyway, let's get her started.
Have you taken your German lessons? Oh, yes, sir. Good. You. How do you say thank you in German?
If you've never played Wolfenstein 2, it's kind of hard to explain because you need a lot of context. Because it's a game where you kill Nazis, but you can also listen to them talk. And despite the plot being about a white guy defending America, a bunch of gamers thought it was anti-America, or at least anti-white.
Come and fucking get me, you white-ass fascist Nazi pigs.
And people were really mad about this. But the weirdest part was that the people who made the game saw all that internet anger and basically said,
So, fuck those guys, like,
it sounds like...
True,
okay,
and real. Yeah, fuck those guys. Nazis, fuck them. They're shit. And hey, here's dexdigi himself.
About Trump here? All right, wait a second. So the guy on the left there, that's me. And you might be wondering how I got there and why I'm asking that question. So this was 7 years ago, and I was working for Vice News on HBO, and I was doing a segment on a game called Wolfenstein 2, The New Colossus. So this is Pete Hines, who was then the senior vice president of marketing for Bethesda, which was the company that was publishing the game. This game was about to come out, and people were threatening to boycott it. You'd think he'd be concerned, but this is what he had to say about it.
fuck those guys, like,
So that's not his full answer, but
They should have had a Bhagat Singh mod for this game where you can fight the Nazis as an Indian freedom fighter. Well, you know, this isn't like the sort of like interesting part of this video, Boy Meets Mini. Like, I mean, broadly speaking, like, this is all shit that is highly fucking agreeable. Like, the more interesting stuff, like I said, it gets into it like a bit of a while into the video, but it's important for it to build a lot of context.
I think we need more context to understand all this. So let's go back just a few months to June of 2017, when Pete Hines walked on stage at E3.
Thank you very much. Good evening and welcome to the 2017 Bethesda E3 Showcase.
The presentation went on for about half an hour, but it was the trailer that they played at the end that got everyone's attention. It started off with these fake 60s TV shows that were all weirdly Nazi-themed.
Okay.
I think I remember.
They finally showed some gameplay.
I said a couple of months ago that the thing that Machine Games was working on is fucking bananas, so now you know what I mean by fucking bananas. So if you visit our booth this week at E3, you have a chance to go hands-on and begin the fight to rally the resistance in
This is
America
from
against the Nazi regime.
2017.
Again, this was June of 2017. Then, in August, a group of white supremacists organized a rally called Unite the Right in Charlottesville.
Hello,
Before it
Charlottesville.
happened, not that many people were taking it seriously. But then America woke up and saw that someone had been killed. And they saw the footage.
Oh, hey, it's the Tiki Torch losers. Who remembers these guys?
People had different reactions to this. Donald Trump, who'd only been president for a few months, infamously had this to say.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
Fine people on both sides. This was literally 7 months in, dude. They were fine people. Which people thought, like, fine people, and they immediately start playing, like, the Tiki Torch bearers. A little weird, Trump.
You had people in that group,
The fact that there were neo-Nazis openly marching around shocked a lot of people. And then, while the headlines were still fresh, just a few weeks after that rally, 2 days before the game's supposed to come out, Bethesda makes a tweet. And they've included a video.
Wonder why Bethesda's doing that.
This was a pretty stark pivot. The old ads were high budget, well produced, and they had kind of a sense of humor. But these new ads were much more to the point, and you could even say they were confrontational. And they were drawing connections between the fictional Nazi timeline and specific references to real events and things that Donald Trump had actually said.
You can now see the connection that dexdigi's sort of making here. Like, now why is Bethesda sort of making these correlations? Could be because of outrage marketing, you know, that get a lot of people mad because they notice the sort of success that Keurig had with it, you know, get people talking about the game, right? And this is a pretty good way to get a lot of, like, people triggered and talking about the game, a lot of free advertisement, which is what I think its software was primarily doing when they were putting this out. An effective marketing strategy, for sure. Especially since we're talking about the killing of, like, Nazis and shit like that, because it had the absolute intended effect. Conservatives got real triggered, real mad, saying like, oh, why is there politics in my fucking video games? You know, that stupid, tired, idiotic, like, Gamergate trope. As if, like, there hasn't been politics in video games since, like, the inception of the video game. Stupid. Obviously, that's a whole different point in and of itself. But it had the intended effect, right? A buzz was created. A lot of people got angry and animated and triggered, and they were starting to talk about the game. A lot of, like, analogies can be made, like the sort of, like, boycott attempts of Hogwarts Legacy. I've talked about it before. I've talked about why it's just stupid and ineffective, and it's going to have the exact opposite intended effect. And would you look at that? Yeah, it had the exact opposite intended effect. I even defended Hassan when he was just like, I'm going to do a trans charity stream playing Hogwarts Legacy, which I was just like, yes, pervert the sort of intentions and ideas of what Hogwarts Legacy is into something that is good and positive. And then, like, all the dipshit woke scolds got triggered about it because none of these people understand political strategy and efficaciousness. Now, you may be saying, why are you comparing these people to, like, all the dipshit far-righters? Well, the far-righters were triggered about, like, Wolfenstein 2 because, they were mad about the fact that they were being directly called out to their face for as to what they were. And that was fascists and Nazis. That's what they mostly got mad about and why they wanted to sort of boycott the fucking game. They were upset that they were being called out directly. Which is how, like, the two sort of movements here are different. But they had the same intended effect. That is getting people to talk about the game, to cover the game for general different political reasons or whatever. Or other, like, reasons. Because, like, people are just like, oh, man, I just like the Harry Potter game. I understand that, like, J.K. Rowling's, like, a piece of shit. I just like Harry Potter because something childhood. Even though, like, I'll be honest, Harry Potter books, they were fucking dog shit. I used to love reading in junior high. Harry Potter books was what killed it for me because those books were fucking ass. I think it was Order of the Phoenix. And I was just like, I got like halfway through it. I'm just like, I can't fucking do this anymore. This shit's just too boring. Fuck that. Yeah, I like the Lord of the Rings way more. Lord of the Rings was pretty fucking good. But yeah, like, you know, we could talk about sort of outrage marketing for as to why, more than likely, id Software and Bethesda did this. But there is also a sort of political angle with this. They're tying a lot of, like, fictional sort of other world idea of, like, you know, the Nazi regime winning in World War II to real life political shit. Which they did it because of political outrage. It was relatively easy for the far right to sort of try to glam on and talk about, like, you know, not politics in my video games. Which, I mean, if you engage with that for even 3 seconds, it's stupid, because there's always been politics in video games. Art is subjective. You know, not everything is sort of like zero-sum gain. Always has to be a rigid interpretation of art. But again, that's not possible for a conservative to interpret, so they have to just get mad and triggered about it. You know, Jacob Geller video, withstanding, obviously, the test of time, as always. But the sort of, like, direct parallels that id Software was making were accurate. There was a lot of far-right sentiment rising up during that time, during the first Trump presidency. You know, and don't be surprised when the fucking same thing also happens during the second Trump presidency. It's the same shit's gonna happen. It's probably gonna be worse, because a lot of the sort of institutions that are supposed to be watchdogs for this are being, you know, subverted from within. But, you know, that's a whole different topic. Aware. Yeah.
A lot of people did not like these ads. Reviewers piled in, saying things like, the game might as well have been made by the terrorist outfit Antifa for all it says about white people. And the people who saw these new ads
It's so funny, because, like, literally all those Steam curated groups say the exact same fucking shit. Like, too much anti-white rhetoric in this game. It's just them, like, pointing out, hey, this is kind of bad, isn't it? Kind of weird, Yeah, the woke curated lists are so fucking goofy, man.
Wondering, is this about Donald Trump? So I asked the question. Make America Nazi free again, or not my America. Basically, it sounds like, okay, are we talking about Trump here?
Well, no, we're talking about Nazis.
You're kind of poking the hornet's nest here.
Maybe a little bit, but the hornet's nest is full of Nazis, so fuck those guys. Like, I'll poke a Nazi hornet's nest.
Look, in a lot of ways, not all that much has really changed in the last.
It's interesting, because I think dexdigi gets into that. That's a sort of, like, very reactionary way of thinking, right? What Peter Hines is saying there is absolutely correct. Yeah, fuck that hornet's nests. Fuck that hornet's nest. It's full of Nazis. I have no problem with poking that. Same with myself, with a lot of the content that I make on Asmongold. I poke the fucking nest, they start buzzing and getting real fucking mad. And dexdigi does get into this eventually. That is a very reactionary way of thinking. It is. Like, you are just acting on a perception. Like, this is why I generally have, like, a problem with, like, reactionary being sort of coded as a right-wing thing. It's politically neutral. Anyone can engage in reactionary thinking. I engage in reactionary thinking. Everyone engages in it. And even though in this particular reason, in this particular way, it's based, fuck Nazis, obviously, it is reactionary.
7 years, because we're still having the same debates, the same arguments, and people still making a lot of the same comparisons.
That's
He
true.
made a statement that I'm like Hitler. It's just couldn't be further from the truth. It's just the opposite, actually.
I mean, you know, he has referred his political opponents as vermin, along with immigrants poisoning the blood of the nation, which is direct Nazi rhetoric, and exact same stuff that Hitler has. So again, I've talked about those speeches before. I don't know why. Well, because the Democrats fucking suck at politics. They should have been sort of like dink donk, hey, this is Nazi shit. This is really fucking bad. But they didn't, because they suck. They don't want to fucking engage with those, because you may have to get into scary territory here, talking about the basis of American racism. Talking about how, in reality, the Nazis really liked America because of how they did their racism. And dexdigi gets into that, which is correct. A lot of the racial politics and positions were inspired directly from Jim Crow, the redlining and stuff like that. A lot of the segregation laws that America had in place during the 1800s. A lot of it, and like dexdigi also gets into it. The Nazis actually toned it down, which is fucking crazy in comparison. Which is crazy because the Nazis are broadly speaking known as being shown as like, hey, these are the guys who, well, had extermination camps of religious minorities they didn't like, political prisoners and opponents, communists, Jews, the whole 9 yards. I didn't see this anger around Red Dead Redemption 2, even though you literally free slaves and shoot up clan meetings, because the correlation wasn't made so bare. People, broadly speaking, in their heart of hearts, understand that, slavery was bad. Even, like, average sort of, like, conservative types. The thing that the id Software did in their fucking advertising is that they made it too real, essentially, right? And sort of showed it, reflected the fucking mirror directly in people's faces, saying like, I don't know. This seems kind of like weird fucking Nazi shit that's going on here. And it's correct for that. And we know why they did it. They wanted to spur outrage for outrage marketing. There's an overall monetization sort of, yeah, right. Our Red Dead Redemption 2 didn't reference our current era at all. It's a century ago. Exactly. That's distant and far away, where people already sort of have like a general societal consensus saying like, yeah, what you're doing here in Red Dead 2 is broadly based and good, because we understand, because we've been educated to sort of understand like, oh, this is just a bad thing. But again, if you take that mirror directly to people who think that what Trump is doing in terms of a lot of the rhetoric that he espouses about immigrants and shit like that is actually a good thing, they start to be like, hey, whoa, hold on, wait a minute. I don't directly think that. This is directly affecting me, but like, I support the guy. Wait, hold on. That's not me. You get a backlash to that. That's reactionary. A lot of it is like the sort of like consequences of like general sort of reactionary like sort of engagements with politics and rhetoric.
Look, if you didn't like Wolfenstein, that's fine. This video is not about making fun of you. And as a matter of fact, I think we should be taking some of those criticisms seriously. Because look, a lot of people feel like Wolfenstein is too harsh on white America.
Wolfenstein is a little weird about white people. I mean, it introduces the Black Panthers as a moral authority. It repeatedly suggests that America is and has always been an inherently racist country. And it paints some Nazis as pretty decent people.
But understand that?
Which isn't an inaccurate interpretation, However, the sort of counter arguments that you'll see immediately, it's like, oh, well, what about the Civil Rights Act? And it's just like, when I typically hear about stuff like that, like, I always like to focus in on particular policy, like the failures of the Reconstruction era, the sort of like failures of the Americans to sort of deal properly with all the slave owners, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, that have allowed segregation to be able to rise back up. The thing that ultimately inspired the Nazis. Because the Nazis saw like what America was doing in terms of racism. It's like, wow, they're treating their like minority civilians as like second-class citizens, but they're not overt about it. Whoa, that's really impressive. How are they doing that? And they copied a lot of those sort of Jim Crow-esque era laws and stuff like that, right? The the redlining, the colored entrances to schools, shit like that, Because in reality, did the extermination programs come immediately? No, they didn't. The gas chambers were a sort of a byproduct of basically like a way to try to erase the evidence of the crimes that the Nazis were doing to the minority populations within Germany. You know, the Jews, the Slavs, the disabled people, and their political opponents. They decided to sort of like kick that shit into gear because they're just like, oh fuck, we're starting to lose the war.
We probably need to back up a little bit.
The story.
So Wolfenstein 2, The New Colossus, is, like the number suggests, it's a sequel. And it's set in 1961 in this alternate reality in which the Nazis won World War II and have colonized America. If you've ever seen Man in the High Castle, just imagine that they sent the main dude to the gym for like 5 years, they gave him a laser, and they said, all right, bro, do your thing.
Kill.
But Wolfenstein itself has a history that goes back to 1981. The series actually got its start on the Apple II with Castle Wolfenstein.
Yeah,
so the basic setup of the
Wolfenstein's
game
a
is
very
that you're a
old
captured
game.
prisoner of war and you've been locked up in Castle Wolfenstein. Your mission is to find the Nazi war plans and escape the castle. But to do that, you need to sneak out of your cell and avoid detection by the guards. From today's perspective, it kind of looks like an elaborate Pac-Man, but instead of ghosts, it's Nazis. A lot of people consider this the first real stealth shooter game, and it makes sense because there's probably no Metal Gear without Wolfenstein. But the Wolfenstein franchise, as most people know it, didn't start up until over a decade later. 1992, Wolfenstein 3D drops on the PC. It's World War II, you're an American spy, you've been captured by Nazis and thrown into a dungeon.
I think my dad also played this game back in the day as well. Back when he used to play a lot of video. He played a lot of Wolfenstein games. A lot of the older Wolfenstein games. I wonder if he would ever play any of the new stuff. Well, I mean, he thinks like playing video games is cringe now or something. Well, whatever dumb shit. Anywho.
So far, pretty similar to the OG. But in this version, there's no more sneaking around. The stealth part that was a signature feature of the game is gone. In its place is, well, this.
Yeah, it's a Doom clone, but now you're shooting Nazis instead of demons.
It was fun, it was bloody, and it was a smash hit. Game historians generally point to Wolfenstein 3D as the birth of the first-person shooter genre. That's not to take away from other games which had tried a 3D first-person perspective before, but id Software's take was different, for two big reasons. First, on a technical level, it was incredible. Texture mapping, digitized sound effects, enemy AI that responded to your movements in pseudo 3D space, all running at 60 frames per second. This game was unbelievable technologically. But id Software's true stroke of genius was in understanding how to make animated violence palatable. Pretty early on in video game history, violence was a touchy subject. The most infamous early example is Death Race from 1976.
All the sort of like satanic panic, like precursor to all that shit, you know. People were also going crazy. Like, it, you know, the sort of standard American sort of fear-mongering campaigns. Like, oh man, all this violence in video games is making my kid want to do school shootings and shit like that. Because during this time, you know, the 80s into the 90s, there was a big crime wave. And instead of actually addressing the root fundamental causes of why there was a big crime wave, that being Reagan's dog shit fucking policies that were affecting the poor, the American state, the broader establishment, wanted to deflect the blame and decided to choose violent video games. Yep, Columbine also happened at that time as well. Because again, people were very poor. They were being radicalized into doing, well, heinous acts.
This is an arcade game where you drove a car around and crashed into enemies.
But, you know, instead of blaming Ronald Reagan, what did America do? Oh, yeah, we have to blame violent video games, which is obviously stupid.
Who would let out this digital scream when you ran them over. Parents were already creeped out enough that their kids were hanging out in these smoky, dark rooms with flashing lights, but now they were committing virtual vehicular manslaughter, complete with death groans. This was about 5 steps too far, and it's hard to overstate how completely wild this game was, because again, this was 1976. Gerald Ford was still in office. People had Pong machines at their house still. People were really, really mad about this game.
It's not a Volkswagen, it's not a Christmas tree. Right? It's a human being. Is it harmful? To the extent that it again sanctions practice, training, learning how to hurt, kill other people, it sets the stage for when people are instigated to aggression to use those skills that they have.
Yeah, dude. I'm using my skills in my muscle car to run over people. I'm being trained to become a fucking freak in a car to just randomly run over people. It's like the same arguments that people had about, like, GTA, you know? Like, broadly speaking, everyone understands that GTA is just very cartoonish and silly. Same with this. It's silly. I guess like it's more like sort of abstract because it's like, you can kind of may like, it can be this, can be that, because it's not like over the top enough. Kind of hard to do it with that art style, obviously, but like, it's like it should be fairly obvious that broadly speaking, I think kids know that running over people with a car kind of bad.
Developers tried to explain that these were gremlins or monsters, and you weren't running over humans, but the public didn't buy it. And before long, the game basically disappeared from arcades. Now, fast forward a couple decades, and we've got, for the time, an immersive 3D experience. It's not just cars, it's guns. And the graphics and the screams are much more realistic. And let's put this into context, because again, this was 1992. The very next year, there would be congressional hearings about violence in video games.
What you're about to see are scenes from two of the most violent new video games. First, we have Mortal Kombat. Blood splatters from the contestants' heads. When a player wins, the so-called death sequence begins. The game narrator
They even criticized Lethal Enforcers, which on paper seems like it would be an okay game because you're a cop that's fighting crime, but they really didn't like the guns.
Making a game and selling it that encourages a kid to point a gun at a television set. I mean, we're all aware of this incredible outbreak of gun violence in our country. Is it responsible? Let me put it another way.
But Wolfenstein, which had guns and blood, managed to avoid getting criticized in those hearings. They didn't even get a name drop. And it kind of makes sense, because what? Are you going to complain about killing Nazis? They're Nazis. They're basically not people. They're monsters, right? And that's where this new reboot becomes a problem. Because in this iteration...
So yeah, this is where things start to become... This is where the presentation of the moral quandaries become sort of air apparent. It's like, okay, interesting. Not boy meets Smitty.
Wolfenstein, the Nazis are very much people. And if you play the game as the creators intended it, you run a pretty high risk of accidentally agreeing with a Nazi.
Wie können Sie Gewalttäter gut gutheißen, nur weil wir anderer Ansicht sind?
Die sind halt gewalttätig, Karl.
Denen fehlt die moralische Richtschnur. Wir sind doch auch Menschen. Gewalt führt nur zu noch mehr Gewalt.
Das stimmt, Karl. Gewalt ist niemals in Ordnung. Niemals.
Was für eine Gesellschaft wäre das, wenn ich jeden töten würde, der meine Ansicht nicht teilt?
Ein Kriegsgebiet, Karl. Das wäre ein Kriegsgebiet.
Zum Kotzen. Übrigens, hast du dich für New Orleans beworben?
Na klar. Und du?
Auf jeden Fall.
Vielleicht sind wir in einer Todesschwadron.
Now you see, this is where it become the sort of like quandary is presented, because like, if you want to be hyper fucking technical about the argument that these two fucking dipshit Nazis are presenting, it's just like, what they're saying isn't technically wrong. Technically speaking, it's not wrong. Obviously, the problem becomes pretty self-evident and apparent. They're Nazis. They support, or maybe not support necessarily, the most violent extremist regime on the fucking planet that is known about, right? But here's the thing. There were a lot of people who were ardent supporters, but they were a minority of the population, obviously, the actual genuine fascists. And this is a sort of story that has played out. And there's most of the people who overall agreed with the Nazi regime, played along to get along, keep their head to the ground because, well, I don't know too much 100% about like what's going on with like all these policies, like what the Nazis are doing. But like, I'm just trying to like sort of like survive and do my day-to-day stuff. That was most of the citizenry, right? They probably understood like if you didn't like do the Sieg Heil or whatever, or like you looked at a particular officer the funny way, you can get fucking blackbagged for it. So a lot of people played along to get along. And there were also a lot of people who were genuinely didn't agree with what's going on, but were too afraid to sort of too afraid to voice those opinions, because they know what happens to those who voice their opinions. They get killed. That describes most Modi voters. It describes a lot of fascists in general. You can even make the same analysis of Trump supporters, and heavily also tied into a lot of MAGA regret types. They went along to get along because they agreed, like, yeah, I have like a problem with like X thing. Yeah, I think like Trump's gonna like try to fix it. And then they see like the complete shit show disaster that was always going to be played out. Oh, and then they're just like, oh fuck, wait a minute. This is a complete fucking mess. Obviously, if shit like that was like expressed within Nazi Germany, all those people would probably be killed via firing squad. Guaranteed, they would be killed. Because again, they're going against the sort of party line. It hasn't gotten that bad yet within the US. Not yet. But again, the thing is, that's what's being presented here. This is an argument that on a very hyper-technical degree, you can agree with. It rings very hollow because it's coming from two Nazis. But we don't really know the case of, like, why these guys are, like, Nazis, right? Why they're stormtroopers. There's a lot of conscription that happened within Nazi Germany to, you know, fill in the ranks. A lot of people simply just, or people just went along to go into the army because they saw that's where the most benefits come from. Or, you know, they did other trades and practices because they got subsidies and benefits from the Nazi government for doing those particular things. That's the sort of moral quandary. It becomes like, oh, wait a minute, hold on. This is a little weird. This can be, like, agreeable. But these are Nazis. We generally understand that these guys are monsters. And this is the sort of, what I brought up earlier, a lot of the reactionary thinking that comes in, right? Because it becomes difficult if we're, like, talking about, like, a sort of the morality and, like, the ethics of, like, these sort of, like, situations. Yeah, like, there was a lot of conscription of South Asian people because they were lured into fighting the English colonizers. Exactly. Now, they're fighting for a good reason. They want to push the colonizers out of the Indian subcontinent. But there were coercive methods that were used to recruit those people. And generally speaking, when we hear about coercive methods that were used to recruit people into an army, we broadly understand that as being bad. But they're fighting colonizers. I see the same thing in modern-day Israel. A lot of people, everyone in Israel, is conscripted to join the IDF. If you don't join the IDF, there are consequences. You go to jail. Like, there's this one kid, I think, who's gone to jail like 6 times, not wanting to join the IDF because of what they're doing to Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Based kid. Based. Absolutely. But, again, you have to think about in the mind of a lot of those conscripts. Now, a lot of lefties are not going to fucking like that. I like what I'm just going to say here. Do you think that a lot of, like, conscripts within Israel want to join because they just want to kill Palestinians? Maybe. Probably. I think also a lot of them are also trying to go along to sort of get along. This is the society that they have, that they were raised in, and they broadly understand, like, I mean, I don't want to deal with any consequences from the state, so fuck it. I guess I'm going to have to do my year or whatever within the IDF. And a lot of them are obviously hateful fucking bigots who just want to have Palestinian blood on their hands. That is true for quite a lot of Israelis. I don't think that's hyperbole at all. A lot of the exact same shit can also be applied here in the Wolfenstein games and in general with Nazi Germany. Now, I don't want to make it look like, oh man, Daho, are you like saying that like the Nazis don't have blood on their hands because of all the atrocities that they committed? No. When I'm making very distinct differences between the state itself, because obviously it was the objective of the state to perpetrate all of these racist laws and everything, the sort of like hierarchical system of what was being maintained within Nazi Germany, and a lot of the thoughts of like individual sort of citizens within Nazi Germany. They had a lot of different thoughts. Obviously, a bunch of them were horrific, racist, Nazi pieces of shit. Obviously. I've had to explain to lefties here how violent voter suppression in India makes people vote out of fear for Modi. Brown shirts were called poll stations and asked who you voted for. Same shit fucking happened in Nazi Germany. By the way, it's the same shit is also fucking happening in the United States of America. Greg Palast has has a documentary about this, about like these volunteers that monitor poll stations that are obvious like agents for the Republican Party. And they monitor who you vote for. So a lot of people might be forced to vote out of fear because they don't want to have any reprisal. Same shit with like people who get conscripted within various armies. They join out of fear or to go along to get along, or because, well, they just want to murder people and have blood on their fucking hands. There's people who are just bloodthirsty like that, psychopaths. It's complicated. And these are the quandaries that you ask yourself. The moral quandaries within Wolfenstein 2.
Hoffentlich. Wir arbeiten doch gut zusammen, oder? Ja.
Well, the political division in the country undeniably deep right now.
Navigating a divisive political climate on a range.
Republicans attack Democrats, and Democrats return fire. Social media is a showcase of our anger. An analysis by the New York Times this fall found that online use of the phrase civil war has exploded.
If you were to remove that from its context, that conversation sounds completely reasonable. Violence is wrong, and political disagreements should be handled in a civil manner. And in 2017, this was a very serious...
Even the RSS and other brown shirt groups recruit young men to get them out of poverty. It's a story as old as time. Same shit with the U.S. Army. Probably also the same shit with the IDF. Same shit with all of these different military structures. It's all about establishment of hierarchy, obviously. That's the sort of ultimate that's the ultimate first order of principle over here. The hierarchy to be maintained.
Serious conversation because people were arguing over whether or not it's okay to punch a Nazi because, somebody punched a Nazi.
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Hello, Richard.
Which, of course, Wolfenstein couldn't resist making a parody of for another advertisement.
Based.
Maybe you're seeing a pattern here. But this conversation takes place between two Nazi stormtroopers.
Like, we can understand that it's okay to punch Richard Spencer because he was, at the very least during that time, or still pretty much is, an out and about Nazi. We know. He has all the same mannerisms, all the same conspiratorial beliefs and everything. He is a Nazi through and through. So we broadly understand that he is like the sort of like archetypical sort of like modern form of the neo-Nazi, right? Of like what you could potentially expect to see and understand from if you were in Nazi Germany from the 30s. It's okay to beat the shit out of that guy, to, punch him in the head or whatever, because he's a monster. He is, not human. We can all probably broadly agree on something like that. But again, like what was brought up earlier about a lot of the other sort of individual citizens, who are going along to get along or do things out of fear, which dexdigi also brings up.
So you're crawling up a staircase, your fingers on the R2 trigger, and you're thinking, I think my mom might have posted something like this on Facebook last week. Do those Nazis have a point? Am I supposed to shoot these guys? In fact, aside from a handful of almost cartoonishly sadistic characters, a lot of the Nazis in this reboot seem pretty reasonable, and some of them are deliberately depicted as sympathetic characters. So there's this part where you're hunting down some Nazis who've been hiding from you for months. They're not trying to attack you. They don't want to attack you. They're trapped in the lower part of your submarine, and they just want to escape. And you overhear one of them trembling in fear at the thought of having to confront the terrorist. By the way, that's you. They call you a terrorist. And you also hear his older brother consoling him and saying he'll protect him.
This is such an interesting sequence. Like, this sequence is fascinating, I have to say.
Auftaucht, sind wir in Sicherheit. Brüderchen. Und jetzt sei tapfer und mach dir keine Sorgen.
In order to progress in the game, you have to kill both of them. You also read postcards from sons writing to their mothers back home.
Pretty crazy, isn't it?
The Nazis in this game are people. These are people who have friends, families, emotions, fears, hopes, dreams, just like you. At one point, you even have to confront the family of someone you killed. This all probably seems like a really bad idea because once again...
It's interesting, right? The game is humanizing Nazis. They're doing that. And like I mentioned earlier, you don't necessarily know about these sort of like ideological predilections or like as to why those guys are in the uniform, right? You don't really know. You just sort of like are expected to just kill them because they're bad. Reactionary thinking, right? Essentialist thinking, which, if we're talking about, like I said, with the Nazis, like the sort of out and about sort of ideological Puritan Nazis, reasonable. I also say a lot of the, like I said before, with like the MAGA regret types, like people who voted for Trump and are expressing regret for voting for Trump. I don't think that you should like automatically dismiss them. You should talk with them, have conversations with those people. They may not be as horrible people. They just decided to either go along to get along with like whatever social circles that they were in, you know, we're social creatures and shit like that. Or they do it like out of fear or because they thought of a particular thing. Propaganda is very powerful. It gets things to it gets people to think in particular ways, right? That's the purpose behind it, obviously. And voting, like Boy Meets Minnie said, voting is mostly cultural in the US. Yeah, exactly. Like, if you do like, you know, if we want to do like a sort of assessment of like particular material conditions for a lot of these individuals, you can kind of understand like why certain people either think and behave in certain ways, right? Even if they're like as abhorrent as fascists and Nazis. You can. And it's more interesting when you think about like a lot of, like I said before, MAGA regret types, or like, you know, people who get conscripted into the IDF. You know, broadly speaking, people who can just be like, we all know that these people are wretched, horrible people. Period. End of story. But like, if you just, or like at least the people that are running those organizations, wretched, horrible people, is mostly what I'm talking about when I say these things. But the individuals, it's a lot more gray. Way more fucking gray. I think it was a recent Dark Matter video, right, who was talking about like our new political religions. And the overall message of that video is to not fall into essentialism. I'm summarizing here heavily. Don't be reactionary. Do not be essentialist. Be subjective. Think about why certain things happen and why people think in particular ways. And this video also, I think, really, really hits on this point that I'm outlining quite heavily.
Again, we're talking about Nazis here. This is a group that we consider to be universally evil.
Wretches.
And so wouldn't humanizing them be immoral at best and dangerous at worst? I mean, these are monsters, right?
Das war dein Bruder, du Sauhund! Ja, Bruder!
That sequence in that game was fascinating to me, because it's just like, oh, that's fucking crazy. Because you're supposed to think like, well, I'm killing like two brothers here, like by blood, they're family, and you know they're Nazis, so fuck them, kill them, right? When you don't know necessarily the reasoning for as to why they're a part of the army. And you saw immediately, what were they mostly caring for and thinking about? Like, oh, you killed my brother. What the fuck? I'm going to kill you because you killed my brother. That's like a very human sort of reaction. It's just like, am I supposed to sympathize with these kids? Which is what dexdigi is sort of like outlining here. It's like, am I supposed to sympathize with these people? This is weird. Like, what's going on here? Crazy. Now, I guess I suppose I could posit my fucking opinion with this. If I don't know the sort of like particular reasoning for as to why I'm like that you like joined like the Wehrmacht or whatever, am I going to be sympathetic with you? No. You still have overall fucking choices, right? You can choose to either like leave. You can either choose to just resist and just not do it. You might die, but hey, I understand like if it's like really difficult for you to make those fucking decisions. You as an individual care more about your overall sort of survival, right? First and foremost. So again, you might just go along to try to get along, doing things out of fear. Fear is a very powerful response and emotion that people generally sort of engage with. So obviously, like, it becomes like, oh, are you the baddie? Like, is that like a question that you're supposed to ask yourself? I don't think so. I think it's fine to be like, no, I don't think I'm a baddie because these guys are fucking Nazis, just to get rid of them and kill them. But like, what I'm essentially saying here is, I don't think it's necessarily a sort of bad thing that you might dwell on the fact like, oh, I just killed those two brothers. I mean, that's kind of sad, but like, they're Nazis. I think what I'm essentially saying here is that I think it's fine to sort of have like the moral quandary. Like, it makes sense to me why people probably think like that, which is what makes that like particular scene sort of so fascinating. Because I don't want to like engage in like the sort of like zero-sum game. They're Nazis, you automatically just killed them. But it's also like difficult with like Nazis because it's like you should just engage with it that way. It's really, really, really fascinating. Fallout and Elder Scrolls are full of these moral quandaries. Yeah, like what? Like in Skyrim, for example, the Civil War sort of narrative, right? Do you want to support like the Imperials, right? Who do not treat Skyrim very well, and they're just here to sort of put down and quell a fucking rebellion for their own imperialistic gains and aims? Or do you want to help this sort of the Stormcloaks, the rebellion, who are really fucking racist to a lot of the minority populations that live within Skyrim? Skyrim is for the Nords. They're like fucking nationalists. It's just like, you have to sort of like weigh your options there. It's just like, well, what's like worse and what's better here? I don't fucking know. It's a difficult fucking decision, isn't it? That's sort of like what the Wolfenstein games are doing with like the outright most evil regime on the planet that we broadly understand is fucking evil.
That would be a fair criticism, but it wouldn't be the first time it's happened. We could go back to 1963 to the political theorist Hannah Arendt when she was dealing with precisely this same problem. She had just published a study of Adolf Eichmann, who was a Nazi leader who, among other things, organized the sending of Jews to the extermination camps. Arendt went to some of the trial, and she described it in articles she wrote for the New Yorker, where she concluded that Eichmann was not a monster, but instead a, quote, terrifyingly normal person.
That is a fucking take. Crazy wild take.
Is not really what people expected from someone who was herself a Jew and had to flee Germany as the Nazis rose to power. And
it really shows the sort of like effect that a lot of like the propaganda that the Nazis had, and the sheer amount of propaganda to sort of make like these horrible, horrific acts of genocide and ethnic cleansing as normal. It's crazy. Because honestly, like, I look at this guy and I'm just like, he may look like and act like an incredibly like normal human being who has like, sort of like grounded potential ethical and normal like ethical and moral reasonings for as to why he did what he did. I still think he's a fucking monster, and just be like, well, no, what you're doing is rather wretched and horrible. Normalization and its unintended consequences. Exactly. Similar with the United Daughters of the Confederacy. What do? Help to normalize the Confederacy because of a lot of the the ineffectiveness of the Reconstruction era and how it basically got fucked over by Southern Democrats during the time. That's like a pretty good analogy here, right? Oh, excuse me. The sort of like normalization of like the sort of Southern myth, a lot of the propaganda that the United Daughters of the Confederacy, a lot of propaganda that they did in order to normalize Confederate generals as like good, honest men fighting for states' rights. We all know that sort of narrative, right? And like a lot of historical revisionism that they also engaged in the South to sort of like maintain the mythology of the South as this oppressed minority from the oppressive North coming down and instituting their laws that they never fucking voted for into law, right? Yeah, the northern aggression sort of myth.
A lot of people attacked her for humanizing a man who committed unimaginable crimes against humanity and for trivializing the horrors of genocide. But Hannah Arendt countered that her point was never to trivialize anything. She wanted to argue that, quote, under conditions of terror, most people will comply.
Yep, this is the point that I was bringing up. Under conditions of terror, most people will comply, but some will not. What I've been generally sort of highlighting, like, a lot of individuals have their own reasons for doing what they did, right? Whether it be like your average Confederate foot soldier during the Civil War, or your Nazi sort of soldier, IDF conscripted troops. A lot of them have their own particular reasonings for as to why they're doing what they're doing. This is not a very fine people on both sides talking point. When Trump was doing that, he was talking about how in reality, because a lot of his supporters were the ones behind the Charlottesville rally, which killed someone in a vehicular manslaughter. Keep in mind, he was doing that to cover his own ass. Being like, wait, these are like average normal people. Like, I don't know what you mean. They're fine. And we're talking about like the people who are doing like the Nazi fucking slogans, right? He was doing that to cover his own ass. Just to be extremely fucking clear. Like, this is not a very fine people on both sides. This is more of a commentary on the overall psychological predisposition on what a lot of individual people were thinking during those times.
That some people would fight, but most wouldn't. And their fascist government would dehumanize people and turn them into, as she said, functionaries and mere cogs in the administrative machinery. She had a phrase for this.
That's true.
The banality of evil. Hannah Arendt's work is still...
The fucking classic line to this fucking day, the banality of evil. Evil has quite a way of turning people into absolute fucking monsters. And they do this through a lot of different coercive tactics, fear, terror, threatening. You could say this about pretty much most, if not all, sort of totalitarian and authoritarian regimes. You can say that, generally speaking, of a lot of nation states in general. The banality of their evil. Getting people to sort of go along to get along. You can say this about the Iraq War. An objectively evil thing that the U.S. perpetrated. Objectively speaking, we all understand, wow, that was really fucking bad. But a lot of people found it as really, really popular because of how effective the fucking propaganda was to galvanize people into being incredibly patriotic, to fight the terrorists, fight Al-Qaeda or whatever, get those WMDs from Saddam Hussein. And if people voice wait a minute, hold on, I think there might be some weird sussy shit. People hounded you and were vociferously shouting you fucking down and getting you and doing threats to you. Is crazy. I know someone who did one tour in Afghanistan and 2 tours in Iraq who initially wanted to serve his country but then got really disillusioned. He was an Air Force recon pilot. And that is pretty much the case for all of the veterans from the Iraq and Afghanistan war. All of those guys are incredibly disillusioned. All of them. And you talk with those veterans, they're all disillusioned with that. Because, and I would say this, a lot of the propaganda around the Iraq war just wasn't effective. It was not good propaganda. It was just bad. And a lot of those mechanisms that, generally speaking, a lot of totalitarian and authoritarian governments wouldn't necessarily work because within the U.S., that's just unconstitutional. Even Colin Powell, who was the main guy who presented the evidence to the UN, that little fucking baggie he had of evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, even he expressed like, yeah, I don't know about this one, guys. I'm kind of like 50-50 on this one. I don't think this is going to work like you guys are going to think. Yeah, Colin Powell expressed doubt, which is crazy to think about.
Controversial to this day, which we're not going to get into. But I think that the concept of the banality of evil is helpful to put into context for what I think Tommy Bjork, who was a narrative designer for the Wolfenstein series, was aiming for. So I don't have the footage for this conversation. I think we might have cut it out of our video interview, but this is how I quoted him in an article that I wrote for Vice back then. He said that, I think all societies are susceptible to those kinds of ideologies, those kinds of fascist ideologies, if they don't fight them. He also said, I think that's something you get to see in the game. There's a whole spectrum of reactions within American citizens toward this takeover. Some of them welcome it. To be really abundantly clear here, Tommy Bjork...
And the same thing would have happened. Like, the same shit, honestly. If you apply this to a modern context, some will welcome it. Some will be against it. I honestly, and I've seen Vosh make this exact same argument. And I agree with him 1,000% on this position. He basically mentioned the things that would be necessary to maintain the sort of hierarchical structure needed for a fascist/Nazi takeover of America. Most people, once they realize what is going on, they will be against it. It just has to hit them in the face. Some people will absolutely be for it. That's not a question. 1,000%. And some will be, like I said before, indifferent to it initially. And then they see the sort of byproducts and consequences, and they'll be like, oh, fuck. Holy shit. This is really fucking bad. And they're going to come out against it. Again, it's a sort of byproduct of, like, how effective, like, political propaganda, terror and fear and authoritarianism can be in, like, trying to maintain control. But eventually, it always collapses in on itself, generally speaking. It's something that can never be sustained.
Bjork's point was not to suggest that the Nazis had a point, because he and I both agree that they did not have a point.
Yeah.
It sounds kind of personal for you.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I fucking hate Nazis. Can you say that?
But you can say that.
So, pretty bad.
I think what he's getting at here in this interview is maybe better summarized in some of his work in this scene.
Monsters did this. Not monsters. Men.
That's fucking sick writing, by the way. That's really good fucking writing. Because with Blazkowicz, he's sort of like engaging with it as like in the sort of extremely reactionary sense, right? Like this sort of point I've been like harkening back to. Like, shit, I gotta play this now. I gotta play this too. Like, the writing is fantastic. A lot of the scenarios looks really fucking sick. There's a lot of people, like, thinking of, like, people, and just, like, other games that have done this before as well, like, that try to, like, frame, like, your enemies as, like, only monsters. You should, like, dehumanize them. And it's like, well, not really. They're still people. It was men who did this. We have to think of them as, like, individuals. Why are they conditioned to think like this? It's important to reflect and look at the root causes. Why are people like this? It's very fascinating.
Let's talk about America a little bit. One of the most striking pre-release advertisements for this game is this scene right here.
A big fan of DK Frank's Jeff.
Let me expect to happen. What's wrong with that, Wayne? Nothing wrong with that, Jeff.
I like your style, Americans. Very good.
It shows a Nazi soldier having what looks like a pretty friendly conversation with two hooded Klansmen. And it gotta make sense, right? It's two evil groups getting along together.
True.
Someone even posted it on YouTube, and it's got some pretty funny comments. But if you...
This is why I quit racism. Too many sweats. The Synths in Fallout 4 are a product of the Techno-Fascist Institute, but they're real human beings. Exactly, yeah. Or like Detroit Become Human, right? Like, like Detroit Become Human, right? Like, aren't the androids that were created that are explicitly dehumanized against, where they were created by like a corporation, right? But then you have to sort of engage, like, are they human? Well, they're made out of machine, but they act exactly like humans. It's just like, oh, that's a little weird. And they were made cynically by corporations to turn a profit, right? And that's like sort of like I think what David Cage was the guy who made Detroit Become Human. And that's like the sort of questions that you're that the game is forcing you to engage with.
If you actually play the game, the part after this is not funny. There's a lot of really unsettling stuff that they don't show you in the ad. And to see that, you have to actually explore the town. So this is where we get to see what a normal or banal day looks like in America. If you hang out long enough, you'll eventually hear someone complaining about their slaves acting up because apparently the Nazis let them have their slaves back. And then there's this woman who thanks the Nazis for ridding the country of certain elements of American culture.
I just couldn't stand all that primitive jungle music they used to play.
Oh no, not the black people playing the music. No, the actual vestiges of like American culture.
Jazz and rock and roll, quite verschrecklich, like you would say, right?
Yes, good, Fräulein Edler.
The most vile and disgusting characters in this scene are not German, they're Americans. In fact, there's times when even the Nazis seem a little bit confused about the mechanics of white American racism. Earlier on in the game, the daughter of a Nazi general runs away and joins your team. And when you first bring her onto your ship, she notices that there's a black man in the control room. And she freaks out because she doesn't understand.
Radio contact with an American resistance group in New York City.
The same thing also happened with a lot of like reintegration after segregation. Like a lot of people freaked out. There was a reason why like the why Dwight D. Eisenhower had to deploy, what was it, the 101st Air Brigade in order to enforce reintegration in that one particular school. I never fucking remember, honestly. I know of the image, you know, with like the paratrooper there with like his gun in hand, just like kind of sitting and chilling there, right? Making sure that, you know, the people are getting along in the schools, right? It's crazy. But this is how a lot of white people thought back in those days.
Do you allow blacks on board? Oh my god, how did that man get in here? No.
Everyone is allowed on this boat, except Nazis.
Now, I want to spend some time here because why she says that.
That's really, really interesting. That's really good writing there, too. Because it's just like, it's sort of like, it's a sort of like look into the sort of like mind prison of that is the Institute of American fucking Racism. Like, especially back during, because this is the 60s, right? Reintegration would have happened not that long ago, right? And what were the consequences of that? Well, there was a lot of white flight to the suburbs, right? And this is when the Republicans were being more racist and were starting to pivot more towards the Southern strategy, you know. It's like Lee Atwater said, you can't say N-word anymore. That's uncouth. You can't do that anymore. Now you have to talk about forced busing, reintegration, and shit like that, right? As far as scuffed as some Bethesda games are, their writing is great. I like, honestly, I've never disagreed with that, honestly. I've always thought the writing for Bethesda games has been quite good. Like, this is great stuff. Because it really makes you think. It's just like, oh man, why does it happen like this? It makes you engage critically. It's really good. Really, really good writing here.
Why she reacts this way. The story leaves it kind of ambiguous. And I think there's a couple possibilities here. Maybe the most obvious one, or the first obvious one, would be, okay, well, she's a Nazi, so she's racist, and so she would hate black people, right? That makes sense. But it doesn't really seem to...
That's like the sort of essentialist reactionary way of thinking, right? Like, gonna have to call you out here, lefties. That's how a lot of lefties think. And most of the lefties that think that way, Marxist fucking Leninists. Because again, what is it all about for them? Maintaining order and hierarchy in their own way. Nazis obviously are not a part of that hierarchy, as correct as that is, but it's still about essentialization and reactionary fucking thinking, which is always bad. A lot of people think in particular ways because of complicated reasonings, right? Material conditions. I thought MLs were supposed to be materialists, right? We're they're Marxists, correct? We're not engaging with material analysis here. Well, why did that Nazi girl think in those particular ways? Why did she have doubt? I haven't seen the game itself, so that doesn't necessarily get into it. But maybe she started expressing doubts. Doesn't really agree 100%. Like, maybe she thinks like she met like a black person one day and says like, oh, these guys are actually not that bad. They're not that bad. I like them. They seem quite all right. And generally speaking, a lot of people think in essentialist reactionary ways because they haven't engaged with particular groups of people. You're told to believe what you're supposed to believe from on high, and you, as a stupid little drone, decide to take like, oh yeah, that means that has to be 1000% correct and consistent for everyone. Well, that's not how that works. Not at all.
To work out, because later, that same black dude, she has sex with him.
Crazy.
I'm sorry, did you need this boat?
Hilarious. You know, I've made this exact same fucking meme before, you know. It's, you know, playing into, like, the tropes of, like, the This is also really good fucking writing. They know, like, you know, the sort of, like, fears of, like, white people within, like, the cities wanting to leave the suburbs because, like, black men are gonna ravage white women. You know, a story is all this time. Like, a lot of, like, fascistic movements are built purely off of, like, psychosexual stuff all the fucking time. Not the defiling of our pure white women by the black beast or whatever, you know, shit like that.
Yes, motherfucker.
So there might be another explanation here. Maybe she's just confused because she speaks English and she's studied America, she understands American culture and American racism. And you've got a bunch of Americans on board. So why aren't you all racist like most Americans? All right, let's back up a little bit. So the same year that Wolfenstein 2, The New Colossus, was released, another piece of Nazi history-related media also came out. But this wasn't a fictional alternate history. This is actual, real history. And this book, Hitler's American Model by James Whitman, explains that a lot of Nazi policy came from the United States. The author explains that in the early 1930s...
This is what I brought up earlier, but yeah. Now right here, dexdigi is going to get into that.
The Nazis were not planning on extermination. They thought the solution to their Jewish problem was either forcing them out of the country or at least taking away their rights and isolating them. But they had no idea how to write policy to achieve this goal. They needed a blueprint. And they found their biggest inspiration in America.
And I think, yeah, this is also the same shit that Vosh also said as well about, like... Because, again, I've said this before. Fascists and Nazis are not good statesmen. They don't know how to do anything. They're fucking idiots. So obviously they had no idea of, like, well, we got into power and we need to get rid of the Jews somehow. How are we going to do that? Well, I don't know. It's like, why don't we just try forcing them out? It's like, well, how do you do that? I don't know. Something. something, the barrel of a gun. Well, that's not probably going to be effective. You know, because it's going to make them hide or whatever. So again, they look to America to get inspiration. You know, Jim Crow, like especially during this time. You know, Jim Crow, the failures of Reconstruction, yada, yada, yada. There's a reason why, for example, those Hugo Boss uniforms, where were they fucking inspired by? A brigade in Massachusetts, I believe. Don't remember 100% which one, but it was based off of, like, a brigade in Massachusetts, which is crazy to me.
Legal scholars were extremely impressed by American racism. They thought it was amazing that even though we had things like the 14th and 15th Amendments, making sure that former slaves were A, citizens, and B, had the right to vote, that we'd still figured out these clever workarounds to make it actually almost impossible for black people to enjoy those rights in practice. We had somehow managed to create a new second class of citizens. And what we'd done with immigrants was even more impressive. Hitler himself admired how America, quote, simply excludes the immigrant.
Yeah, like, especially during that time, what? It'd be like tenement housing and shit like that, like in New York. Otherizing, like, a lot of, like, the propaganda posters that you would see talking about, like, the Irishman and the Italian taking away good-paying American jobs and shit like that. That was commonplace all the time during, like, the 20s and the 30s. Like, blaming the immigrants that were coming into America for the Great Depression. That was super fucking common back in the day, right? And it otherized people. Turned them into second-class citizens. Which inspired, obviously, you know, Funny Mustache Man.
Of certain races. And he was equally impressed at our genocide of Native Americans to make room, or Lebensraum, for white settlers.
Yes, he was also a big fan of... I forgot, yeah. He was a huge fan of Manifest Destiny. Huge fan of that. Because, again, same logic applies of Lebensraum to Manifest Destiny. You know, the pushing out of Native Americans, whether by force or like economic coercion or whatever, into the reservations.
And as the author says, indeed, in Mein Kampf, Hitler praised America as nothing less than the one state that had made progress toward the creation of a healthy racist order. The Nazis considered America to be the most forward-thinking country on the planet in terms of racist policy. For the Nazis, American creativity wasn't just about writing pop music or Hollywood movie scripts. It was in writing imaginative laws to deny certain races access to actual American citizenship. And the most impressive thing to them was that our discrimination was all done by the book. Everything was legal because we made it legal. So the Nazis tried to catch up to America and started adapting our laws. But they didn't just copy-paste our policies into the Nazi law books because, as the author says, the Nazis treated American race law as too harsh to be borrowed wholesale by Nazi Germany.
That is fucking crazy to think about. Like, America, you know, now we have like the fucking America stands coming in instantly saying like, yeah, that's right, because America fundamentally was like evil and shit like that, blah, 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 blah. You're falling in for the reactionary trap, the essentialization trap. It's correct to say that about the American state, but do individuals think like that? Not really. Not really, generally speaking. Certainly, there's a lot of people within America who do think that way. But again, material conditions. Why were they thinking that way? Could it be a byproduct of their environment, of the media that they consume, of the sort of like propaganda that swirls around constantly in their area? The sort of social group that they have around them who are just like, you know, racist, bigoted pieces of shit or whatever. There's complicated reasonings as to why these things are the way that they are. And a lot of, and this is why I say, like, Marxist-Leninists are fundamentally incapable of engaging in these forms of fucking critiques because they themselves are also essentialist and reactionary. They can't think in, like, more lateral, critically thinking ways because, again, they themselves are also reactionary. They are also like the things that they purport to dislike.
Let me say that again. The Nazis thought our laws, especially things like our Jim Crow laws, they thought they were too harsh and that they needed to be toned down to work in Nazi Germany.
It's crazy.
As the author explains, in the 1930s, the Nazis thought of their program as a, quote, more thoroughgoing and rigorous realization of American approaches toward minorities, even if the regime had shifted its sights to a new target in the form of the Jews. And it wasn't just Nazis taking notes from Americans, because Americans were also taking notes from the Nazis. Just months before World War II broke out, 20,000 Nazi sympathizers gathered at Madison Square Garden for a rally. And this wasn't the only group. In another book, Hitler's American Friends, the Third Reich Supporters in the United States, Bradley W. Hart explains that there were a bunch of groups that were big Hitler fans. These range from political groups to Christian
Who remembers America First?
preachers. A lot of people thought that Nazi-style fascism should be brought to America. The America First Committee was even trying to get a fascist-friendly candidate to be elected president. The guy they thought would be best for the job was Charles Lindbergh, who was the first man to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. Lindbergh never actually said he wanted to run, but he was pretty racist, and he was a celebrity, so the smart racists thought he might be useful. Fortunately, most of these groups were very badly organized, and they usually fell apart because of mismanagement or infighting. All of this is to say that not only did the Nazis find us very interesting and sometimes useful, there were a lot of Americans who were also pretty fond of what the Nazis were doing too. And if a few things had gone differently, the world of Wolfenstein could have been real, aside from the lasers and space colonies and stuff.
Don't you just love parades? They make you feel so safe.
Yeah, it's very fucking interesting, isn't it? To think about. Yeah, America. What we all know, like the image, right, of like what is it? Like the pacifists type as well. I would argue that those are also like a part of like Hitler's American Friends, right? Because it's just like, well, as we all know, there is no reasoning in terms of like a Nazi in terms of peace. Appeasement was an obvious fucking failure. Like, no shit. Obviously. Appeasement just didn't fucking work out. Hitler was still doing his expansionist goals and aims, and he was still conquering other people. Mostly European countries, of course. But you can say that it's just bad based off of the fact that, you know, just conquering people is just bad. That's just like a sort of first order principle. Just be like, yeah, personally, I think just imperialism is bad. But the thing is we knew what Hitler's intentions were. Like, he made it outlined and very clear with the idea of Lebensraum. He wanted to conquer the whole world for Germans, right? So to say, like, you can have peace with someone like that, can you? Can you have peace with someone like that? I would argue no. Obviously not. Like, what are you saying? You can't, you have to treat that person with the utmost of contempt. Because, again, what is it all about? It's all primarily first about the complete and utter maintenance of that violent hierarchy.
Look, I'm not trying to hate on every American ever, because obviously there were Americans who were not convinced by this fascist rhetoric. And we see those people in the game. But it's interesting. So early on in the story, your character meets a woman named Grace Walker.
Just who the fuck are you, white boy?
Stay calm. Let me first make it absolutely clear that I am not a Nazi.
Now you bring Super Special back in and you put him down right now. I will shove this grenade so far up your ass, I'll be dancing and rejoicing as your entrails trickle down from the ceiling. You dig, man?
She's the leader of a resistance group called the Black Liberation Front, which seems to be a pretty clear reference to the Black Liberation Army, which was an actual real organization partially comprised of former Black Panthers. They even have buttons that say Free Huey, which is the campaign to free Huey Newton, who's another Black Panther, and again, this is a connection to real life. Once Grace Walker enters the picture, she immediately takes charge of operations. From this point on, she's the boss. But if you've played the previous game in this reboot series, you'll probably realize that her function as a character is, well, not much of a character. She's really there more to serve as a vehicle for a particular message. Specifically, she's kind of like an expanded version of this other character in the previous game named Jay, who is an obvious Jimi Hendrix reference, who's mostly there to explain Black people's take on Nazis.
Throw me in the gas chamber just like they did all the others.
None of that has anything to do with me. That's not the America I fought for.
Really? I was little. My mother wanted to take me to the picture show, but we had to go in through the fucking colored entrance. I wanted a hot dog and a lemonade, but the sign says we don't serve Negroes in this establishment.
It's very, because, yeah, the black people's perspective on this, or the black perspective on this, is like completely fucking different, right? I remember him from New Order. Yeah, he seems like a pretty fucking based character. You know, he's supposed to be based off of what, Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix. There we go. I love probably being dyslexic. Broadly speaking, like, a lot of African Americans, generally speaking, understood that throughout the generations that America is still a fundamentally racist country, right? Jim Crow, the segregation, redlining, yada, yada, yada. This is a sort of like, I guess it's like being challenged more by like black conservatives and like black people sort of more and more being able to enter the middle class. I guess like a sort of, I don't know how to really say this, like a sort of like second reconstruction kind of Electric Boogaloo, although not really. Because a lot more people are like becoming like there's a lot more black people that are sort of like forgetting this sort of legacy and are becoming like more conservatives. You know, there's still a minority amongst the black population. Black people are still incredibly poor and are broadly speaking like widely discriminated against, like, you know, shit like stop and frisk, redlining, yada yada. Yeah, Larry Elder is a good example, or like Byron Donalds. Because like the Republican Party, they sort of understand now at this point, like in conservatives, which is why I often say like you know, fascists are becoming like way more liberal and like filled with like fucking identity politics. They probably understand like, okay, Americans know that if you just do the complete overt segregation and racism and like colored entrances and shit like that, there's going to be backlash to that. It's not politically efficacious. The same sort of like Lee Atwater type of thinking of, you know, the sort of introduction of the Southern strategy. It's like, oh, you can't say N-word anymore. You have to now talk about states' rights and forced busing and shit like that, right? Same fucking concept applies in the modern age. But now it's like, I guess this is also sort of like a consequence of like liberal progressivism. The arc of progression keeps going forward, and there's nothing that conservatives can ever do about it. But there's always going to be constant tugs and battles and wars over like what is allowed. Because now you have a lot of like, there are conservative black people who do like the whole like stupid like, man, if honestly like those lefty Democrat black people, they'll be able to do it and get out like me, you know, survivorship bias and shit like that, right? That obviously wasn't as like sort of prominent and clear back in those days. The Civil Rights era the Civil Rights Act getting passed sort of like shattered that more or less, and like a lot of black people becoming more and more a part of the middle class also sort of like shattering that kind of perception, right? Now you have like the Republicans having to obviously shift strategy. They're still racist, and obviously they're going to be racist and maintaining those like hierarchies. But they now broadly understand it's like, well, we can't be as explicit as it used to be back in like the 60s. You know, it's interesting to think about the sort of like tugs, the pushes and pulls that sort of happen right now. Like it's going into a aggressive direction. Like a lot more people are, especially you notice on like social media, actively being racist and regressive, right? Like there's like how like you see on like fucking Twitter, how many people are like posting like Hitler speeches or whatever the fuck. It's fucking crazy now, right? The right is clearly on the sort of offensive, but you know, as we all have seen, the arc of history, shit like this doesn't tend to last for very long. I guess this is like my sort of like hopium pill message, but it's going to be rough for now.
You're a patriot. Blue-eyed, jarhead, motherfucking Nazi-killing patriot that you are. You're still a fucking puppet to the man. You're exactly the kind of guy they ordered in come luncheon time.
That's true.
You don't get it, do you? Before all this, before the Germans, before the war, back home, man, you were the Nazis.
That's true.
Be careful what you call me. Violence. Language of the man. Can't you see?
And I hope it doesn't, because the way the internet propagates this shit makes it last longer. That's true, yeah. Like, we are living in, like, a fucking completely sort of a different, like, era. But, I mean, it's kind of, like, think of it this way, Boy Meets Mini. Like, it's becoming cool to be, like, a blue-haired SJW again, right? There's always, like, in fights like this, there's always a reactionary pullback and like the sort of like progressives, you know, yoinking it back. It's a constant ebb and flow. Yeah, it's back to like being progressive like it was during the first Trump administration. It's now countercultural. It's cool to be like progressive now. I hate the fact that this is the way that it is, but like, because there's like no ideological sort of basis. There's no like grounding to any of this. It's just like, you know, to borrow what I was talking about before, to go along to sort of get along. I would prefer if there was like a more rooted, grounded sort of ideological sense that it's like, no, it's just like the reason why people think in these ways is because it's a good way to think, which is kind of what I want to generally push with a lot of my videos. At least I hope I'm doing that effectively. It's good to be supportive of minority populations because of the fact that they have faced discrimination and attacks for no fucking reason, generally speaking, because people just simply otherize them throughout history. And generally speaking, like a lot of people, especially now in modern society, are more and more recognizing that, which I think is a good thing. At least in North America and the West, even in like a lot of parts of Europe, broadly speaking, there's always going to be like heavy reactionary fucking backlashes, but it's something that has to be constantly battled, talked about, and pushed through. That's what I am effectively here trying to do. Create the media that shows like, hey, it's just good to be a good person. Kind of a deal.
We're all just brothers and sisters now, aren't we?
Grace and Jay are examples of a kind of trope that functions within this game. The people with the best grasp on reality and the people who truly understand America in the Wolfenstein universe are black. White people, there are exceptions, but white people are generally either clueless or they're complicit with the Nazis. And finally, here is maybe where we can address some of those complaints from people who gave this game bad reviews. This game is not saying that all white people are bad, obviously, because the main character, the guy you control, Bailey Blazkowicz, is white, and he's a good guy. What it is saying is that for white people, it's possible to be unaware of what's going on. and that is not a luxury that most black people would have. I mean, let's go back to how we first meet Grace. One of her first functions is to point out the inherent racism that America had even before the Nazis arrived, and tells your character that not all white Americans even want to be free of the Nazis.
Right, Grace. Put the fighting spirit back in the American people. Ignite a revolution.
Shit. We've been fighting every motherfucking day, Blazkowicz. White America, though? They done packed up and given in. See, I guess they don't have the fighting spirit no more. Nah, they just do whatever the fucking Fuhrer tells them to do.
That's baloney. They want to fight the Nazis just as much as we do. All they need is for someone to show them how.
You know who's running the South after the Nazis took over? The Ku Klux motherfucking Klan, am I right?
That's it.
So what you gonna do? You gonna go down there and hold hands with them and build bridges and persuade them to join our cause? Get your head out your ass, Blazkowicz.
And now I think we're starting.
Yeah, again, here's the thing. This is also its own sort of like tug and pull, right? Because generally speaking, I would kind of agree with Blazkowicz here, saying like there were people, especially back then, who were just not picking up the fucking fascist Nazi shit, right? Those generally are people who are more left-leaning. They're a minority, right? Like in the 30s, it would have been people who were part of the Communist Party, for sure. But hey, because of a lot of the actions from, say, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the failures of the Reconstruction era, there's still a lot of fucking racists that exist within white America and would simply go along, and it simply would be not go along to get along. There are people who would go along to get along, and that's generally the sort of people who are more unaware of the fundamental sort of like problems, historical issues of America. They probably have an understanding of it, but like it's not that really deep, and they haven't really like questioned and thought about like why it's that way. And there's obviously the people who would willingly fucking join, right? Absolutely, you know, your Klanners, your fascists, your Nazis, other like sort of like racist conservatives, shit like that. And then people who simply will just do shit out of fear. It's a really good, accurate descriptor for, you know, the soldiers within the Wehrmacht, people who are conscripted by the IDF, people who are God, what was the other fucking example? IDF, the Wehrmacht, and yeah, I'm fucking blanking right now. Anyway, whatever. Two very prominent examples. People do things out of fear because they want to just survive. Just want to get along to get along because they're just critically unaware. They haven't done any examinations of the history of like the ideological reasonings for as to why these things are the way that they are. And there's the obvious collaborators, people who are willingly like, yeah, I actually want this. People are fucking complicated. So what Grace is saying isn't wrong. Same with Blazkowicz. What he's technically saying isn't also wrong, if you want to think about it.
To get a little closer to what some of those angry commenters, those angry reviewers were mad about, because some of them probably felt a little bit attacked. But hold on. I don't think it's fair to say that everyone who was angry about this game was a literal Nazi sympathizers. I think a lot of people who are angry at the game, at least the way they say it, is that they're not angry about the politics of the game. They're angry that the game has politics at all. That political themes don't belong in a game. Games are fun, and this is just a game. Okay.
See, okay, but this is where I might disagree a little bit with dexdigi here. That argument is a red herring. It's a complete red herring. The problem that a lot of these dumbasses have, especially with the anti-woke SJW types, is they want to enforce a certain cultural and social hierarchy, right? They want overall what the Nazis were pushing, right? I don't think like dexdigi is being dishonest here at all when he's like not engaging with that premise. But if we're talking about these sort of like punditry, like, you know, like your fucking quarterings of the world, heel first babyface, yellow flash guy, critical drinker, there's 17 trillion of these like stupid anti-woke, anti-SJW types. They want to enforce now Asmongold. Yeah, Asmongold. They want to enforce a particular set of social and hierarchical standards. they actually like what the Nazis are pushing, which is what makes them really bad. If we're talking about the individuals that are commenting, talk about wanting to boycott the game, they have their own reasonings for as to why they think of those things. Some are unaware. Some are doing things out of fear of their own social group, and a bunch of them are collaborators. They agree with the message, right? You know, you shouldn't have a politics in your video games because it's dumb. I've talked about why that's the case. Oh, art is political. Everything is incredibly subjective if you're engaging with it. Blah, 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 blah. Obviously. It's you know, Jacob Geller video withstanding, obviously. But those are like sort of like the overall, I'd say, 3 pillars of like when people are saying they want to boycott the game. Those are probably like the sort of 3 sort of tiers that they're falling under, right? Like it is just incredibly fucking dishonest for us to why they're saying, oh yeah, there's no politics in video games. And I mean, a lot of people who say that are either just critically uneducated or they know and they're just trying to push a particular message. These same people will play Skyrim with NSFW mods and no politics there. Sure. Yeah, exactly.
I think what's behind that kind of thought is the recognition that a game can be more personal than other mediums. Because look, in a book or a film, there's a sense of distance between the thing that you're experiencing and you. But games are different because you're actually controlling the character. Things don't happen to somebody on the screen. They happen to you. So when someone tells your character that America is racist, they're not talking to that character, they're talking to you. And if you're American, and especially if you're also white, that might make it feel a little bit more personal than you're prepared for.
That's true.
But let's pause for a second, because maybe this game isn't so scary if you're white. I think there's a couple ways of looking at this game. Because on the one hand, there's kind of a white savior thing happening here. So again, you're playing as BJ Blazkowicz, and you find out in the beginning of the game that his mother's Jewish. But that's not really brought up much after that. When people call him white, BJ doesn't correct them, and even the Nazis refer to him as white.
Hey, man, I recognize your face. Very Aryan face it is too. Are you on a station one?
His father's white.
I find it super interesting that basically like BJ Blazkowicz, yeah, because he is like portrayed as like the sort of Aryan, like superior, like Ubermensch, which is really fucking crazy, right? Because you look at him, you look at his mom, he's built, he's muscular, blonde hair, blue eyes, and the exact which I think is a purposeful design choice by id Software and Bethesda here, which is fucking awesome. Great fucking design choice here. I'm like shellacking, I'm like giving the fucking Bethesda the fucking gluck right now. But I think that the writing and the art direction, design of this game is really, really good. I think it should have praise. You look at BJ Blazkowicz, he's like the Nazi perfect idea of like of an Aryan. Blonde hair, blue eyes, everything. It's similar with like Metal Gear Revengeance, with how Senator Armstrong sees Raiden, right? Like a perfect ideal of what his it's not the same sort of like it's not the same like ideological basis, obviously, like with Armstrong, he more pushed like a sort of like Darwinist fascism, basically. But he saw Raiden as like the perfect vestige for that, because he was allowed to do like he was incredibly powerful, like he was like destroyed multiple like fucking giant Metal Gears and shit like that. He just destroyed a giant fucking Metal Gear, and looked at Raiden and was like, oh, this is like literally the guy of like the ideology. He doesn't let like politicians or like regulations get in his way. He just does his own thing, and he does it really good, and he plays by his own fucking rules. And Ryan obviously doesn't really like that. He tries to reject it. He's like, I mean, what you're saying is true, but like, I didn't do it because I want to do it. You are trying to do that because you're like a fucking freakazoid fascist Darwinist. Same thing with BJ Blazkowicz. Like the Nazis, like if he wasn't like an American like Nazi killing machine, he would be like the face of a lot of Nazi propaganda. because it's like perfect for them. He's the Aryan, like blonde hair, blue eyes. Well, he may be Jewish, but like, yeah, we're just gonna ignore that detail. But built, very strong, and you know, he fights, and he's really good at fucking fighting. He's like the perfect archetype, and you know, it's like it's a design purpose to sort of like subvert that idea, right? That like, oh look, the perfect Nazi Aryan is the one who's like doing these like slaughtering sprees on the Nazis. You know, it's a very purposefully good design choice.
And his father is an absolute villain, to the point of being basically a caricature. In the first scene of the game, we see his father strangle a child, hit his wife, hit a dog, spout anti-Jewish tropes, say the N-word twice in the space of like 45 seconds. Right after that, he says something homophobic, and there aren't even any gay people in this scene. And then he makes you kill your own puppy. He's so hateful, it's almost not believable.
Shoot her.
And so, spoiler alert, but this shouldn't really be a spoiler, when we see BJ's father become a Nazi sympathizer later on in the game, we can say, okay, yeah, figures. He was a bad guy back then, and of course he would side with the bad guys. I would never do that. And this is why I think we could call BJ a white savior, because this pattern follows that trope perfectly. So the white savior trope works because film directors know that we can't pretend racism doesn't exist because we know it exists. We've read about it at school. But if you show racism on screen, you risk white people getting their feelings hurt, and they might not want to watch your movies anymore. That's bad. So there's a strategy. You give the viewer 2 white people. You give them...
Yep, it's... what dexdigi's hitting on here is the consequences of capitalism, obviously. Bethesda is a company at the end. They need to make money on their games, right? You can be pretty overt about it, as long as it still makes money. I don't know how, like... Was Wolfenstein 2 profitable? Wolfenstein 2, the New Colossus. Profit. How much money did it make? The New Colossus made about $59 million in gross revenue since its release. Out of this, the developer had an estimated net revenue of $17 million. So they made about $42 million. It won Best Action Game at the Game Awards. Exactly. And yeah, certainly, BJ Blazkowicz, perfect archetype of the white savior. Oh, look at the white man doing all the work for the minorities to protect them against the evil Nazis, right? Like, you know, one for one, yeah, you know, the story is extremely fucking obvious.
One really bad racist one, and that's the foil. And the other person, you give them a good, not racist white person. And you kind of hint to the viewer that, okay, it's, obviously, you wouldn't be that one. You'd be this.
What is it? That's To Kill a Mockingbird, right? You know, Atticus Finch and, I forgot the other guy. I read the book. I didn't see the movie. I read the book in high school.
It's a nice second guy.
In our courts, all men are created equal.
And you could argue that that's what BJ is for. See, controlling BJ doesn't just feel good because you have big guns and heavy armor and big muscles. When you play as BJ, you get to feel not only physically superior, but morally superior. Reading history, and especially looking at pictures from history, is really uncomfortable when you see someone who looks like you in those pictures. We all like to think that if we lived back in some historical period, that we would have been on the right side of history. Maybe we wouldn't be this guy, but we could definitely be this guy, right? But that's not probable. You might not have been.
Yeah, exactly. This is a really, really good point that's being hit on here, right? Like, and it comes back to like material conditions. And again, this is another problem that I have with Marxist-Leninists, because for some reason they do this behavior all the fucking time, all the time. Liberals fucking do this. Marxist-Leninists do this. The conservatives do this as well. You know, which is why I say, like, you know, conservatives nowadays aren't actual conservatives. They're just, like, LARPing liberals, but I digress. It's incredible because, like, the material conditions on the ground, like, during the civil rights era, the 50s and 60s, segregation was still in place, Jim Crow laws. It was a fucking fight and a half to get Lyndon B. Johnson to fucking sign that bill into law. And even, like, to fucking enforce that, like, that was a whole fucking complete ordeal as well. Calling a right-winger a wannabe woke liberal is the best insult ever. Yeah, exactly, because a lot of their behaviors and mannerisms mirror the things that they supposedly really hate. It's really fucking weird, isn't it?
been this person or this person. But statistically speaking, most of the people watching this, you would have been this guy or her or him.
That's true.
If the world of Wolfenstein 2 were real, you watching this video, if
you people going along to get along. Because a lot of people, generally speaking, they don't like to put themselves in the line of fire. They don't. Survivorship bias is a fucking crazy fucking really powerful bias.
Given the opportunity, you probably would have joined the Nazi party. I'm not making a value judgment on you. I'm sure you're a great person. I'm just speaking statistically. Most people will simply comply.
That's true. Exactly.
That's nice, dear. Give my regards to your father when you return to the farm. Oh, and tell him I'm putting some hardworking slaves up for auction this week if he's interested. There'll be cocktails. I'll tell him, Auntie. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye, dear.
This is what
fascinating
was talking about. Playing as BJ allows you to escape that reality a little bit. But then, on the other hand, BJ is a little bit more complicated than that.
It's crazy.
If you know where to look. BJ is not exactly a perfect white savior. He might be the guy who's most physically ready for the job, but he's not a leader. He's a soldier. He has a good moral compass, but we see him over and over again having to have somebody else, usually somebody black, have to explain to him that, look, man, America's actually a pretty terrible place, and it has been for a really long time. BJ doesn't like hearing this, but it keeps being proven to him.
You should come with me. Kind of on the spot, you know. Pretty well cornered by the man, actually.
That is a crazy cutscene, by the way.
Somebody will lay it out for him. They'll explain reality. They'll explain the reality of American racism to him. And in the moment, he'll nod, and it seems like he gets it. And then in the very next scene...
Yeah, and then all of a sudden, just like... It's like, yeah, in one ear, out the other. Crazy.
He's getting offended that somebody else is explaining to him that they see America differently from him. He's kind of ignorant for the entire game. And it makes you wonder why BJ is even on our side. And honestly, if BJ didn't have very serious daddy issues, he might not be. BJ joined the army not to save the world or out of any real sense of justice, but...
You know, that's like the fucking funniest thing about that. That's what it always ends up being in the end, right? Like, serious, like, fucking daddy issues or, like, particular issue, like, why certain people... Like, this probably could apply to me, honestly. Like, I admit it. Caught. I've been caught out. I'm caught. You know, I'm acting like the white savior. No, that's crazy. Caught. It's over for me, boys. I must now be a reactionary or whatever. Memes aside, like a lot of people like will just sort of do things because it is like the countercultural narrative to do that. Not necessarily because they were inherently good people. Like again, like this is where like the whole meme of like morally lucky sort of happens, right? And part of that is true. It's a sort of subjective thing, like a thing you need to analysis, like basis by basis. But a lot of people like, which is why I generally have like a lot of problem by like liberals talking about like morally lucky lefties and like all the fucking dumb fuck lefties who talk about like you know, Nazis who used to be like Nazis, like die in the world fascists and stuff, and now all of a sudden they're like trans lefties or some shit. And they're just like, well, your basis was still like, you started as a Nazi, so therefore, like, I don't know. But like, again, it comes back to material fucking conditions. The thing that I've constantly been fucking harping. Why were they that to begin with? Who the fuck knows? With some of the concept that I've talked about here, they did it out of fear. They did it because maybe they did actually genuinely believe in that. Or they were generally, 9 times out of 10, propagandized into thinking those particular things, or being racist, or, you know, fascist conspiracism. There's tons of reasons for as to why individuals develop the moral and ethical compasses that they have. They don't generally think about it, like, consciously. It's a general subconscious sort of thing that happens. But a lot of it is that they are byproducts of the culture and environment that they are in. Like, and like a lot of people seem to always, like, I expect liberals to fail in that analysis because they're not materialists, but lefties fail in this analysis all the fucking time. It's really fucking weird. Like you're on the left or some flavor of Marxist. Like, you should understand like material conditions, materialism. It's strange. Like, why? and obviously like with a lot of right-leaning people, for them, they're groomed into believing that the things that they're believing in, generally speaking, by the authority figures or the social environments that they're in, which is why like a lot of them are like pushing for homeschooling now, because conservatives now recognize and see that like, oh, if we send our like children to university, a lot of the programming that I've instilled in them, the conservative sort of programming that I've instilled in them, all this grooming that I've done, political grooming that I've done to them, because again, I've said this point before, conservatives do not see their children as human. They see them as sponges, like little versions of themselves. They don't see them as human with their own thoughts and beliefs and, inquiries into things, their own curiosities and whatnot. Conservatives don't see their offspring as that. It's very dehumanizing, to be honest. It's a lot of these things are like these sort of like root causes and modes of fucking analysis that I see a lot of people not necessarily engaging with, which, I have a broader problem with, because again, it's the sort of like it's the Michael Brooks quote, right? A never hate on the individual, hate on the institution. Essentially saying like, you should never just inherently hate on a particular certain person because they believe in a certain thing. That's stupid. You need to think about what is the root. Like, why did they think of those things? Because of yada, 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 yada. Which is also a point that I think like this video is trying to convey constantly.
But as far as we can see, he joined to escape his abusive father.
And reactionary thinking.
Ain't nothing you can offer to make up for what you done to us. I think of my father, I see a fuck you and a fist flying in my face.
When'd you ever do right by me?
If his dad hadn't been such a cartoon villain jerk, BJ might have just ended up as some middle manager working a desk job for the Third Reich. So which is the correct way to look at Wolfenstein? Is BJ a white savior character that lets white people off the hook too much? Or is he a parody of the white savior stereotype? Maybe a little bit of column A, maybe a little bit of column B, or maybe it's something else. A little earlier, we talked about those two books that explain the actual history of American and Nazi interaction and influence. But again, this is a game, which does something that neither of those books do, and does something that maybe no book can ever do. When those books describe Nazi policies, they use words like sinister, or evil, or unimaginably horrifying to make sure that we know that the authors think that the Nazis are bad. And look, I understand why they do this, and don't get me wrong, Wolfenstein the game kind of does it too. It makes it very clear that Hitler is not somebody to look up to. When we finally see Hitler, his mind is completely gone. And
oh, dude, I remember this cutscene. This fucking cutscene is fucking hilarious. It's so fucking funny. Because, I mean, like, yeah, this is obviously how fucking Hitler would have acted. He was a freak. Incredibly fucking paranoid about, like, literally everything under the fucking sun. And yeah, obviously, he was not fucking good. But, I mean, did a lot of people think of it that way? Not really. A lot of people did not think of it that way. Especially amongst sympathizers. Sympathizers, collaborators. Obviously, they thought of him as good, as a, aspirational leader. Especially with, like, neo-Nazis today. You see them all the time on fucking Twitter. They think of Hitler as good. Which is, supposed to sort of be, like, a sort of, like, gut reality check to a lot of, like, average people. That like it's crazy that like these people still fucking exist, because just like, how can you say that they're good? Well, byproducts of like education, material conditions, blah blah blah. But it's really hard for a lot of like average people and like liberals to make that analysis, because they don't engage with like root material analysis. They don't do that, and they don't understand like a lot of like root causes. The stuff that I've been constantly harping on over and over and over again.
And he spends most of his on-screen time vomiting, crying for his mother, or in the fetal position. But with the rank and file Nazis, Wolfenstein is a little bit more hands-off. It lets you experience, even in a small way, what the normalization of Nazism might look like. So let's go back to that small town. Talk to everybody. What do we do with the fact that in this entire town, there are a grand total of 2 people that we could call good guys? The first one is a newspaper seller who whispers to you that he supports your movement. but he's too much of a coward to actually say that out loud.
One Reichsmark. Say, mister, you look familiar to me. Are you some kind of celebrity?
Yeah, like, again, this is the stuff that I've been saying. Should play Sniper in Elite 5 so I can snipe Hitler Adolf in the cojones. True. Again, a lot of people do things out of fear. A lot of people do things because they just want to keep their head down and it's just like another day for them. They're unaware. And there are also a lot of people, generally speaking, who are willing to fight and face the consequences for it. But those people are very few and far between. It takes highly principled people. And of course, there's always the sympathizers and collaborators. Now, obviously, the sympathizers and the collaborators, worst of all. Obviously.
Mister, you... Oh, God. If you are who I think you are, I just want you to know I am behind you all the way.
And then he goes back to selling Nazi newspapers. The only guy who's willing to tell the truth to a powerful figure is this homeless drunk guy lying down by a dumpster. He thinks you're a Nazi and he starts yelling at you.
I know a secret. Well, I won't tell you because you're a fucking Nazi traitor. Uh-huh. But you I can trust.
And then he goes back to talking to his bottle. Which one of these would you be? Which one do you want to be? The cowardly guy who's still selling propaganda? The lady who's sucking up to the Nazi officer? The one guy who spoke the truth and became an outcast for doing it?
It's true.
Most people will comply. And look, I take back what I said earlier. Maybe you wouldn't join the Nazi party. Maybe you'd be one of the few that would fight. Maybe you'd be BJ. Maybe you'd be super special. But maybe you'd be this guy and end up here. When we look at those awful, evil people in our textbooks and think, I would have done the right thing, we sometimes forget that those people probably had their own textbooks and thought the same thing about themselves. The times and the locations are different, but when you play through this game, you might start thinking that the questions have always been the same. If your family member joined a group that you didn't agree,
Like, you have to think about it, you know, I've been at it for so long, my brain is starting to, like, fry. A lot of individuals are complicated for a lot of reasons. It's really difficult to sort of, like, essentialize and sort of, have reactionary thoughts and patterns with them. People do things for their own particular reasons, you know. Beating a dead horse at this point. I've already expressed this sort of position.
agree with or voted for a group you didn't like, would you keep quiet about it so that it didn't cause arguments at the dinner table? If you knew your country was fighting a war to oppress people somewhere else in the world, would you speak up? What if it affected your friendships? What if it affected your job? If it was more convenient to pretend not to see things, would you eventually start to not see them? And if you decide...
I used to think that way, by the way. You know, even, like, I'll be honest. I'll admit it. Depending on the fucking situation, not even that long ago, I tried to go along to just sort of get along, stay with the flow. I'm not really doing that anymore. A lot of, like, things have sort of happened. Like, I've said this before, but, you know, I thought, like, during my sort of political journey, I was just like, well, you know, maybe, like, there's not a lot of people on the left. Marxist-Leninists, there's quite a lot of them. Perhaps for the, you know, sheer shrewd tactical decision, it's fine to sort of, like, let them, you know, spew their idiocy and say their fucking nonsense, because, like, you know, it's it is way more politically efficacious because in the overall, if you want to have a successful political movement, you need numbers. You do. Simply put, especially considering, like, the sort of, like, cultural and, like, political situation that we currently find ourselves in, right? You know, be more charitable to, like, social democrats, democratic socialists, or, you know, liberals or whatever. People who are willing to, like, join in hand and sort of, like, resist. I don't think like that anymore. You know, I guess this is, like... if people, I try to be as subjective as possible about it. You know, I was talking earlier this stream about, like, the sort of death of subjectivity, and how, like, you know, I guess I can also sort of include that part into that, you know, this part here, and how it, like, sort of applies to politics. The sort of, like, problem, I guess this is, like, yeah, part 2 into the death of subjectivity, blah, 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 sort of thing, how it applies to politics. The thing is, like, a lot of people are unwilling to sort of, like, think critically and, you know, mostly just have their own reactionary sort of reactionary thoughts process and are like very set in their ways. And also, yeah, like you just said, Point Meets Mini, keep in mind people politically shift with time depending on material and social conditions affecting them. 1000 fucking percent. You know, we doing our fucking based Marxist analysis. Same thing with like the sort of like subjectivity sort of model. But the reason why I go hard in particular against like the Marxist Leninists is because like it was very clear to me, especially with like the Ukraine war, that they're wholeheartedly incapable of doing that. They're just reactionary and essentialist to the core. They can't engage. They're no different than conservatives, and there's a lot of like analogous sort of like I've talked about them, you know, deifying political leaders, willing to do historical revisionism for our own political purposes. I've harped on this constantly. Same thing with like a lot of other, people in politics. You know, I mentioned already conservatives. Liberals will do this about lefties all the fucking time, but like kowtow to conservatives very often, which is very weird. But you know, whatever. Maintenance of status quo. You have to be very subjective with stuff like this and be willing to meet people where they're at. Politics is compromise. People have said this before. And you need to be able to be willing to meet people where they're at. And be able to fight for a more common goal. That is, you know, bettering the world overall. At least that's what I think.
Finally, that enough was enough. What would you do about it? Argue? Vote? Fight? Who's the terrorist? Of course, none of this stuff is mandatory to beat the game. You don't have to deal with almost any of this if you don't want to. You don't have to pick up any of those extra readable newspapers. And if you think some of those Nazi conversations might feel a little bit too close to home and upset you, you can shut them up by just shooting the offending characters before they start talking. I mean, if you're feeling triggered, pull the trigger. Problem solved. I don't think this game was meant to change anybody's mind about anything, and I don't think it has to. If you're far right, or if you're an actual Nazi, you'll probably just ignore the story. And the further left you are, you're more likely you are to find some of the black characters a little bit flat and maybe even exploitative. I'm not saying Wolfenstein has all the answers or even any answers, but if you're willing to meet the game where it is, or maybe better said, if you're willing to let the game meet you where you are, and treat it as another way to think about something that most people avoid thinking about, you'll probably find yourself asking yourself some questions. But hey, who knows? It's just a game.
Wir arbeiten doch gut zusammen, oder? Ja?
I'm not 100% certain. I mean, I overall understand the sort of like the very apolitical ending message right there, because you know, it's about like the game itself, sort of like not necessarily making like a political prescription, which I understand. It's mostly just talking about the game there. But yeah, like if I were to put my own opinion out there. I think Wolfenstein games should be things that are make Nazis upset. It should be treated as like, you know, political or whatever. Like it's about killing Nazis because, you know, Nazis, they're pretty bad. You can like sort of try to learn and understand like the point that I've been constantly reiterating in this video. The sort of like underlying reasonings for as to why a lot of people believe in the things that they do, complicated reasonings, material and social conditioning, blah, 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 blah. For as to why people are the way that they are, and people are complicated, yada, yada, yada. But, you know, overall, I think it's still fine to sort of just be like, if we're talking about like Nazis, to treat them with the utmost of contempt, right? But, you know, it is also good and important to understand that it is rather important to be able to meet people where they're at, especially with like individuals, like you know, citizens and stuff like that. Meet them where they're at, learn and understand like their perspectives and stuff like that. Even if they are fucking pieces of shit, you can still say like, I think like I wholeheartedly disagree with you. I think you're a fucking piece of shit. I understand like where you're coming from. I still think you're like a wretched, horrible human being. That's fine. You can do that. And I think that's fine. But yeah, like, I'll be honest, you should never show any fucking mercy to Nazis. Because a lot of them, some of them, are able to shift. And you should try to have, like, the sort of, like, you know, I don't necessarily believe in the sort of, like, whole, like, political, like sort of, debate as a de-radicalization tool. It's very fucking complicated and hard. Like, even, like, the main people who push that, like, Vosh, he doesn't agree with that anymore. Because it's difficult. It's hard. To be able to do that, because a lot of people are heavily ideologically rooted. But you need to be able to learn and understand, like, you need to be able to meet people where they're at. If you want to have good, efficacious political change, you need to meet them where they're at. It's okay to not show mercy to these guys, though. I think we are done here with this video. Lovely, fantastic, very cool and very good. We love yapping. Overall, a conclusion, as one always must do. Good video, very, very good video. You know, sort of like thinking about like a lot of moral quandaries and whatnot of well, why the fucking like individuals of within like a lot of like why individuals join wretched, horrible regimes that they do. It's obviously incredibly fucking complicated for a lot of different reasons. People are their own individuals. Subjectivity, it's very important to be able to meet people where they're at. A lot of people are sort of molded and created by their own social and material conditions. People can always change, but it's also okay to recognize that there are irredeemables out there, for sure. I don't think like any of these things are like ridiculous, and I think that video does a really, really good job at sort of by dexdigi does a really, really good job at sort of outlining and underlying that point, sort of like talking about like, hey, like people are complicated. Like it's obvious that a lot of these people are pieces of shit, but like you need to think about like why, because they have like they can have like decent positions about certain things, stuff that you can be like, yeah, okay, I can agree with that, but you're still like a part of this like wretched and horrible thing. Like why is that? And you need to be able to meet people where they're at, talk with people, like with the examples that I've been providing, mostly with like a lot of the MAGA regret type people. I think for them in particular, it is very important to meet them where they're at and sort of learn and understand their underlying reasonings for as to why they supported the things that they support and why they think about the things that they think. Generally speaking, I would say that is the sort of lens and frame of analysis that I think is incredibly important to engage with. And like even with like some of the most like wretched of wretched people, because a lot of people, you know, like I've outlined before, they go along to get along. They do certain things completely out of fear, or they do things because they're just unaware. Or obviously, the people that you should never show mercy to are obviously the collaborators and sympathizers. Some of them are willing to change due to whatever material and social conditions that they're, you know, put in. But generally with people like that, sympathizers and collaborators and people who do have ideological roots, you should never show any mercy to those people. That's really about all I got to say about that.